Welcome everyone, this is Dr. Mercola, and you all are aware that cancer is a profoundly important problem that challenges most all of us at some point, or certainly someone we know. And we're really privileged today to speak with Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, who is an assistant professor at the University of South Florida College of Medicine, and he teaches courses in molecular pharmacology, physiology, and maintains involvement in several studies researching metabolic treatments for the neurological disorders such as seizures, Alzheimer's, ALS, and cancer. So they're all really related, and it's interesting that that there's a central component that is really relevant for so many of these widely diverse diseases. So welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited because you've got you're really on the cutting edge research. I'm wondering if you could explain to our viewers how you first became interested in this area, because it's so fascinating, and I really look at you as one of the primary leaders in establishing some of the basic foundational precepts that we have to treat so many of these wide diseases, especially cancer.
Okay, thank you. My entry into this field of cancer research was pretty unexpected, actually. I was funded to study the effects of gases on the brain. Specifically, the funding was from the Office of Navy Research in 2007 to study seizures related to oxygen toxicity that are experienced by Navy SEAL divers using a closed-circuit rebreathing apparatus. And as I delved into neuroprotective strategies to prevent oxygen-related seizures, I came across the ketogenic diet. And I found it interesting that the ketogenic diet is very effective for drug-refractory epilepsy and a variety of seizure disorders. And in studying this, more intensely, I wanted to develop a ketogenic diet strategy for the warfighter to protect them from the effects of hyperbaric oxygen. And I realized that, your brain primarily runs off glucose for energy. And during periods of carbohydrate restriction or calorie restriction, it can derive fuel from ketone bodies. So I delved into the nutritional physiology, I guess you could say, of ketone body metabolism. And we further pursued ketosis as a strategy for oxygen toxicity and developed ketone supplements, which have been shown to be very effective. And in addition to that, the research indicated that ketosis could be a therapeutic strategy for cancer. And I came across the work of Thomas Seyfried, and I came across a large amount of evidence that suggested that cancer was unique in that it was metabolically unique. Genetically, it was very heterogeneous. So there are a host of different genetic anomalies in cancer cells, but one characteristic is that it had this ubiquitous metabolic phenotype, which was aerobic glycolysis. So even in the presence of oxygen, it was shown that cancer cells continue to pump out lactate, suggesting that they're fueling their metabolism from excess glucose consumption. And, from my perspective, the only reason, cancer cells would be pumping out lactate and deriving energy from glucose at such a high rate would be because they are metabolically compromised with mitochondrial deficiency. So insufficient oxidative phosphorylation, which takes place in the mitochondria, contributes to a compensatory fermentation. So the cells are forced to get energy from somewhere, and the mitochondria are not functioning, so this destabilizes the nuclear genome and activates the oncogenes, which then kind of increase the glycolytic enzymes and the ability enhances the ability of the cancer cells to derive energy from glycolysis. So, in studying nutritional ketosis for an application related to seizures in Navy SEAL divers, I came across a body of evidence to suggest that not only was therapeutic ketosis neuroprotective, and it functioned, ketone bodies function as an alternative fuel to enhance brain metabolism, decrease reactive oxygen species, and also they have a brain stabilizing effect, which we can exploit with the ketogenic diet, which we call nutritional ketosis or ketone supplements. But that there's a body of evidence suggesting that cancer itself would be responsive to therapeutic ketosis, because nutritional ketosis involves carbohydrate restriction. So that would decrease glucose availability to cancer cells, and it would increase the production of ketone bodies from the liver. And your normal cells have the metabolic flexibility to readily adapt to using ketone bodies for fuel. And cancer cells lack this metabolic flexibility to do that. They can't derive significant energy from ketone bodies, the large majority of cancer cells. So in testing our nutritional strategies or ketone strategies for seizures, we looked at a few cancer cell lines and saw a robust effect probably about 4 years ago. And so it all started about 4 years ago as just a simple observation in a glioblastoma cell line. And that led to the work we're doing now.
So you're really on the beginning stages of this, because 4 years isn't really a long time as research goes. So
yeah, I'm brand new into this, and even a junior faculty member, and but it's such an exciting field to be in because there's really not a lot of people doing it.
Yes.
And the reasons for that are interesting, I guess you could say. There's not a whole lot of money, and there's really not a whole lot of people understand nutritional biochemistry, but nutritional physiology is not really appreciated.
Yes.
Kind of how our nutritional strategy influences the body as a whole, not just at the level of the biochemical level, but as a whole.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about connecting with you and dialoguing and understanding what you're doing, because you're really one of the upcoming researchers that's going to, you've got your whole career in front of you, and you're really passionate about this, and you're really going to uncover so many foundational key solutions to these challenges, these health challenges that so many of us or our relatives face. What I'd like to do is deconstruct some of the very eloquent language that you use to explain what you're doing, and sort of simplify it for a large number of our viewers who aren't as educated in nutritional biochemistry. So if I can summarize this, and correct me if I'm wrong, most of our cells in our body, our own cells, have the metabolic flexibility to use either fat or sugar, which is basically the two fuels that we can do. Except for cancer cells, there's some aberration that really allows them not to use this fat or the ketones as a fuel, and they really can only use glucose. So it's sort of a derivative of what Dr. Otto Warburg discovered and actually received a Nobel Prize for in the 1930s, that he learned that glucose or sugar is really the primary fuel substrate for cancer cells. But yet oncologists have ignored this for over 80 years and don't use it therapeutically, which is just reprehensible, almost criminal, because so many people suffer needlessly because they don't have access to this simple nutritional therapeutic strategy. But essentially that's it. That to take advantage of this metabolic differential that cancer cells just don't function on fat, so that if you can shift over. And here's, I guess, where the confusion is, at least my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong because you're the expert here, that most of us have we have limited stores of sugar. We only store it as in the form of glycogen, typically in our muscles or our liver. But that storage is relatively short, typically 12 hours or so. Maybe in some people go to 2 or 3 days, but it's relatively short, whereas fat we can go on for months almost, many of us. So, and it's this conversion, so that, because if we eat carbohydrates all the time, we continually replete that glycogen store, so we never get down to, there's always sugar available for cancer cells. So it's a matter of depleting those glycogen stores and going to ketosis. So maybe if you can expand on what I just attempted to simplify what you mentioned. So.
Yeah, that's a good point, and you bring up a lot of a few interesting questions here. In theory, it's pretty simple, right? You eliminate carbohydrates, you decrease the glucose availability, and you should, in theory, starve cancer cells of their
Right.
primary source of energy, glucose. The thing is that our physiology is a little more complicated than that, and when we, restrict carbohydrates, we may prevent the spikes in blood glucose and the spikes in blood insulin, these spikes are actually very pro-inflammatory. They kick on they can kick on oncogenes and enhance cancer cell proliferation and the metastatic process. These spikes can. So the ketogenic diet and carbohydrate restriction can reduce the spikes in blood glucose and blood ketone and blood insulin, but it does not have a major effect on baseline levels of blood glucose unless the calories are restricted. So kind of getting back to what you're talking about, the ketogenic diet is, I think, it's a very good strategy to make calorie restriction tolerable, because when your brain in particular is craving glucose, and say, for example, you go on a calorie-restricted diet, but it's a high carbohydrate diet, you're still getting fluctuations in blood glucose. And the brain goes through these intermittent periods of glucose deprivation. And, your brain gets very hungry. It's not a very comfortable feeling. Nutritional ketosis, which occurs with carbohydrate restriction and is further enhanced with calorie restriction, forces the physiological shift from a glucose-based metabolism to a fatty acid and ketone metabolism. And when your body is, shall we say, keto-adapted, the brain energy metabolism is more stable, your mood is more stable. It may take a few weeks to adapt physiologically to this, but nutritional ketosis can be maintained and sustained with carbohydrate restriction, and is further enhanced with calorie restriction. And I think kind of that's where you were getting at, that total calories really need to be restricted, and also protein. So protein is gluconeogenic. So there's gluconeogenic amino acids in protein. And if protein is at, say, for example, 2 or 3 grams per kilogram per day, that is probably going to feed into the gluconeogenic pathway, and it will be hard to deplete your glycogen stores, which is necessary in the liver to drive the ketogenesis in the liver. So you really need to decrease glucose availability, carbohydrates, and protein consumption to deplete liver glycogen to maintain and sustain nutritional ketosis.
Well,
and that would be an optimized, approach.
I'd like to tease out those details, because you had mentioned, just to again sort of simplify the process, you had mentioned this rate of protein consumption with 2 to 3 grams per kilogram. That is the reason you mentioned that is because that's the typical amount of protein that a person is consuming?
It's what I consumed for many years when I was, into athletics and more physically active. I'm physically active today, and my protein consumption is probably half of what it used to be, but my performance, surprisingly, is the same or higher. So suggesting that all these years that I consumed very high amounts of protein, it was kind of unnecessary, because the ketones and fatty acids are protein sparing. So if you replace the protein and the carbohydrates, but also restrict the protein and feed your body fatty acids and elevate blood ketones, this will have a protein sparing effect. We say an anti-catabolic effect, and will help you preserve lean body mass and physical performance in the face of a calorie deficit. And this is why the ketogenic diet is an effective strategy for losing weight and retaining muscle, especially if it's complemented with resistance exercise or some kind of physical activity. But we do find that, in measuring blood ketone levels in humans and in animals, that simple carbohydrate restriction isn't enough. You really need to lower the protein. The American diet is pretty high in protein. And to achieve nutritional ketosis, which is an effective strategy for weight loss, but may not be for everyone, because some people, it depends, what the question is. If you're using it for weight loss, or you're using it for a therapeutic intervention for cancer or seizures. And in those cases, you would want a more strict, kind of like a classical ketogenic diet that involves a protein restriction and to some extent calorie restriction, especially if it's used for a cancer therapy.
Well, let me continue to refine this a bit. Where everyone here certainly have heard of Dr. Atkins, who at his time was really probably one of the most popular doctors in the world, and was, of course, responsible for promoting the ketogenic diet. And I think what you're discussing here is a revision of that, because typically the people, and there are many people who still use an Atkins approach, but that's typically low carbohydrate, high protein, and which will not work. It will not give you the results that you're achieving. I think that is really the key crucial element here. And this protein of 2 to 3 grams per kilogram typically translates out to 100, 150, 200 grams of protein per day for some people, which is an enormous amount. And I'm somewhat intrigued with the concept of one of my mentors, Dr. Ron Rosedale, who I suspect you're familiar with also, who's advocating a much lower dose of actually a gram per kilogram, 1 gram of lean body mass. So it's even lower than that. So typically for someone like myself, it would be 50, maybe 60, 70 grams per day. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that, especially in light of this calorie restriction, because that's another important tweak. His take on it, and it has to do with, the reason he promotes this so much is this the protein influence, and specifically some of the amino acids, like the branched chain amino acids, influence on mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin, which is this massive pathway that seems to be largely responsible for much of the pathology we see in cancer growth. So, and that protein actually has a stimulatory effect on this, and when you lower that, then it's more inhibited, I guess. So, I'd like to dialogue about that protein component, and then in the importance of the calorie restriction, because the calorie restriction is another twist that Dr. Rosedale doesn't go into, but I believe there may be some validity to that.
Yeah, I think we need to define kind of what the question is and what the problem is that we want to address nutritionally.
Okay.
And, it's not, I tell people the ketogenic diet, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Even carbohydrate restriction, it's really not a one-size-fits-all. And I think carbohydrates can be titrated in, perhaps, individually. I mean, some people I know have a very high carbohydrate tolerance, and they can get 800 grams of carbohydrates per day, and they maintain a very lean physique. And these are exceptions to the rule. But in and maybe they would get better results with carbohydrate restriction. But I haven't been able to convince them of that. Although they need to get frequent meals. So one advantage to eating a low carbohydrate, higher fat diet is that I can eat 2 meals a day and be totally fine. Whereas, several people I know, including my girlfriend actually, I mean, she needs to eat like every 2 or 3 hours because she has dips in blood glucose levels. And it's interesting. And my lifestyle, and I think most people can kind of put themselves into this category, would favor an eating pattern that is not so frequent. And so getting back to your original question, it depends on what you're using. If you're using it for health management and weight loss, and shall we just put it under the blanket of metabolic health, optimal metabolic health would be achieved with carbohydrate restriction, definitely, but with some level of calorie restriction, either intermittent calorie restriction or some level of calorie restriction to promote a calorie deficit, at least at certain periods of time. And if there is a period of calorie surplus, it should be kind of given in and around exercise, during or immediately after exercise. So we run into, the situation that I think it can all, and Tom Seifer would probably agree with this, that the benefits are of nutrition are achieved when you can sustain a calorie deficit. So, we're all familiar with the benefits of calorie restriction. So from my perspective, kind of like a simple perspective, it's like, how do we achieve the benefits of calorie restriction? How do we maintain low insulin and low glucose levels? So I agree that mTOR is an important signal once you have cancer. Mm-hmm. So, the amino acid leucine is a powerful activator of the mTOR pathway. Now, if a normal, healthy person consumes boluses of leucine, 5 grams, a couple times a day, which a lot of bodybuilders and mm-hmm. athletes do, can this, cause cancer? This is an interesting question, and it's a question that I've been researching. We're about to set up a study where we give large doses of branched-chain amino acids in a metastatic model of cancer. So my opinion is that branched-chain amino acids, which activate mTOR, in a normal, healthy person, are not counterproductive. They do not increase one's susceptibility to cancer. The mTOR pathway is primarily activated in the skeletal muscle, and the leucine is a very powerful stimulator of protein synthesis. And by stimulating protein synthesis in the muscle, you can maintain and build more muscle, and that's the metabolic tissue that consumes glucose and is basically the primary factor in your metabolic health. So by restricting your calories and perhaps supplementing with anabolic or anti-catabolic amino acids, we can maintain a greater proportion of lean body mass in the form of skeletal muscle, and which will be a glucose disposal tissue, and which can help us maintain a lower blood glucose, lower insulin levels, and this can, in the long run, this can potentially promote a metabolic physiology that can prevent cancer and perhaps treat cancer. So even, one of the questions that we want to address, that even if you have advanced metastatic cancer, if you do a ketogenic diet and add high levels of branched-chain amino acids, will that decrease survival time? So this is a question that I waver back and forth on, and we don't really know, and that's why we're setting up the experiment to do this. Scivation is a nutritional company that makes a very popular branched-chain amino acid product, and they've given us a charitable donation. They have a product called Extend, and it's a great branched-chain amino acid product, and it's used by many people that I know in preparation for athletic events and bodybuilding and such. And there are anecdotal reports of cancer patients taking this throughout their chemo, and it helped them retain their lean body mass and had an anti-catabolic effect. So these anecdotal reports had led me to, develop a study to test this. And
well, that is kind of interesting because
it's kind of stepping around your question, maybe not answering it exactly.
Yeah, because in theory, anything that would stimulate mTOR, you would expect to make the cancer worse. But these anecdotal reports sort of, refute that belief. Yeah, well, the leucine is a powerful stimulator of mTOR in skeletal muscle, right? When you have a calorie deficit, your physiology is a little different. It's true that cancer cells do have a hyperactive mTOR pathway, and it's kind of like the default pathway is already activated, right? Whether leucine can feed into that pathway and further activate mTOR, which is already activated, is a question I don't think that has been addressed scientifically. And we have to realize that the activated mTOR is a downstream consequence of metabolic dysfunction, which triggers genomic instability, which then activates the oncogene. So it's the mTOR activation, and all oncogenes are kind of like downstream epiphenomenon of insufficient respiration due to mitochondrial dysfunction. So if so that's in working back, it's kind of more of a downstream event. So what is
that is already activated.
What is your belief that activates it? Is this reliance on excess calories in conjunction with too many carbohydrates?
I think it's complicated. I think there's environmental factors. There's the issue of metabolic health. Over time, the aging process contributes to a progressive mitochondrial dysfunction and a decrease usually in overall metabolic health. Inactivity, poor diet, environmental factors, radiation, chemicals. There's a lot of things that can feed into this. The bottom line is that the genome of the mitochondria is probably more vulnerable than the nuclear genome. So the nuclear genome has more robust DNA repair mechanisms. So over time, cellular damage, inflammation, poor metabolic health will contribute to a progressive decline in mitochondrial function and ATP production. The cell needs to maintain its energy status to preserve the fidelity of the nuclear genome. And when that's compromised by a defect in mitochondrial function and a collapse of the energy systems that maintain proper genomic fidelity, that can activate, especially under certain conditions, can activate the oncogenes. So if someone, for example, in putting it into more of a practical perspective, in someone who's is at poor metabolic health, maybe exposed to environmental toxins, things in the diet, they are challenged by a virus, for example, an illness that is the immune system. That can set them up, to be susceptible to cancer. We all have cancer in our body right now. Our immune system is fighting it off. So it's a failure of the immune system to attack these precancerous cells from becoming cancerous cells that could be important. So it's, and having a robust metabolic health can allow us to adapt to these toxins in the environment, to these metabolic insults, to these pathological situations. For example, we know viruses can cause cancer, but if our metabolic health and immune system is robust, we can fight it off.
Okay.
And there are things in our environment that can prevent us from doing that. But I think optimal metabolic health is achieved when we make the mitochondria work hard and we rely primarily on fats and ketone bodies for our metabolism. And the way to do that is with carbohydrate restriction, and which can be further enhanced with calorie restriction.
And intermittent fasting, which we'll talk about in a moment. But before we hit intermittent fasting, because I think that's an important part of this, is I'd like to comment on the calorie restriction that you mentioned earlier, which I don't think any researcher would disagree with. I think there's a uniform consensus that calorie restriction has been well established to promote longevity, at least in animal studies.
Yeah.
So that's well accepted, non-disputable, non-controversial.
Yeah.
Dr. Rosedale believes that a big portion of that benefit of calorie restriction is not necessarily related to the calories, but it's actually related to restriction of the protein and inhibiting the mTOR pathway. And an observation I've made, and I think that most people would agree with, is that most vegetarians are healthier than the typical American. There certainly are some unhealthy vegetarians, and I state that fully believing and promoting that I believe that we need animal foods to stay optimally healthy. But I think it may be a quantity issue. And my current belief and understanding is that many vegetarians are healthy because they restrict their protein intake, because it's really hard to get a lot of protein from vegetables. It just is a lot easier if you get it from animal foods. So I'm thinking, and my belief now is that there's probably a happy merger between the two, is that if you could radically reduce your protein intake, closer to the 1 gram a day instead of the 2 or 3 that most of us are taking, and make sure it's high quality protein. We don't want animals' protein from confined animal or feeding operations, industrial farmed animals, of course, and free of toxins. But it's just a matter of restricting that and having a lower protein intake in combination with the other healthy foods, that may have a profound influence and may in fact be one of the reasons why the vegetarians are so much healthier. I mean, obviously there's benefit of eating vegetables, but many of them don't eat vegetables. They just restrict animal foods. So, and I think that's the consistency is that this lower protein intake may be profoundly beneficial, maybe even more beneficial than restricting the carbs.
Independent of calorie restriction.
Right.
That's where you're going.
Yeah.
That's a possibility. And I think when you're getting a surplus amount of calories from anywhere, you're setting yourself up for a metabolic, unfavorable metabolic profile, elevated triglycerides, and cholesterol and high blood glucose. So if you have a surplus of amino acids, I guess the question is that going to be more dangerous than a surplus of glucose floating around in the bloodstream? Amino acids have important signaling events that they can initiate, and that it's an interesting question. But I believe that a lot of the vegans and a lot of vegetarians are very particular about the food that they eat. So I think some of the benefits, the claimed benefits from a vegetarian diet or vegan diet, are due to calorie restriction, and it could be an inadvertent calorie restriction because a diet high in fiber, where you're ingesting a large portion of food that is not very digestible or readily broken down into usable fuel, although it's counted as calories, is you kind of have this inadvertent calorie restriction phenomenon. And I think it may explain, for example, the Ornish diet. It may explain some of these results that have been reported in several books, like the China study, where a plant-based diet, has shown to be a good promoter of health. I've seen a lot of blood work from people that can basically eliminate plants from their diet and go on a ketogenic diet, a high-fat, moderate to low protein, very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, and all the markers of metabolic health go in the right direction in most of these people. And if they don't, typically what's happening is that they're not restricting their calories. But most people who follow a ketogenic diet they inadvertently restrict their calories without trying and reap the metabolic benefits of a calorie deficit, which is lowered blood glucose, lowered insulin, lowered triglycerides. Paradoxically, when you're eating more fat, paradoxically your blood fats will go down, because you're at a calorie deficit. And HDL goes up. Almost everyone that I see on these high-fat ketogenic diets, their HDL actually goes up and improves.
Well, let's talk about the fat, because I think really the devil's in the details. And when we're both, I think we're both in agreement on this, but we weren't really specific. When we say increase the fat, we're not talking about the most common fat that people eat, which is highly processed vegetable oils, which are full of omega-6 fats, or trans fats like French fries and donuts. Yeah. We are talking about high-quality fats like avocados and butter and coconut oil and macadamia nuts and olives. These types of fats, which Dr. Rosedale believes are metabolically neutral because they don't tend to trigger those hormonal signaling events like leptin and insulin and the mTOR pathway, of course. So they're sort of free calories that you can take, and would speak to I guess the importance of maybe not so much calorie restriction as what you just mentioned in the example you shared with these people not having plant-based diets but yet having profound improvements metabolically by following a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, I would agree that fats are an important source of fuel. I think the optimal fuel substrate, really, and pro-inflammatory fats can really wreak havoc on the body. And these are the ones that you mentioned. Many of the plant-derived oils, processed oils, can cause real problems. And there's a difference between like an Atkins-based ketogenic diet and a healthy ketogenic diet. So when someone talks about being on a ketogenic diet, I like to find out specifically what they're eating. Many of the classical ketogenic diet is very high in dairy. And I think I have observed in people and myself that when I can minimize dairy protein, dairy fat is another issue, which is not as problematic, but a ketogenic diet that's high in dairy protein what I see is that people can have persistently high blood glucose levels and a low level of systemic inflammation from the the allergens that are in dairy proteins. And my body is very reactive to these things. I get eczema and all kinds of weird autoimmune kind of reactions, but it's kind of a persistent chronic level. And think about what's happening inside the body. And I don't think, it's not like one person has it, one person doesn't. Mm-hmm. There's a spectrum of immune response depending on the person, depending on the level of intake of dairy proteins. And a lot of my friends are big fans of whey protein, drinking whey protein shakes, and I did that for many years. I don't think it's necessary. I think a lot of the fats can be used in place of protein, and I think fats are very protein sparing, so decreasing the need for protein. But a ketogenic diet, and going back to the optimal diet, a ketogenic diet that's high in dairy, which is the traditional ketogenic diet, can be problematic and can prevent many of the health benefits that you can get from a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. Yeah. So it really needs, and a lot of nutritionists aren't really up on kind of these distinctions between, they just view macromolecules, right. They just, what are your macros, and I believe that more attention needs to be paid to the actual composition mm-hmm. of the macronutrient profile that is given to these people. If you're a registered dietitian and you're assigning macronutrients to your client, and kind of if it fits your macros kind of phenomenon that a lot of dieters are using, that the composition of the macronutrients is really important, because some foods are potential allergens and can really be counterproductive, for your health and for weight loss. And these things need to be taken into account, and it varies between individuals.
Yeah, and I believe Atkins is guilty of the same error in that he didn't pay attention to the macronutrient composition. But along those lines, and specifically with respect to dairy, I'm a firm believer if you're going to have milk, it should be raw, and the pasteurization of the milk actually changes the three-dimensional, the tertiary and quaternary structure of the proteins, which can contribute to the allergenicity that you're taking. But the other hidden component, and I really strongly discourage people from drinking milk. I just don't think it's the optimal food for most people, because even raw milk, because not only do you have this protein issue which you referenced, but it's also associated with sugars and lactose. Mm-hmm. So, and it's an interesting combination. But I personally consume about a pound of raw butter a week. So I think the raw animal fats are profoundly beneficial, and they're loaded with nutrients, of course, that is difficult to get otherwise. So. Yeah. I think you're onto something there in your observations, that the people who are following a ketogenic diet that includes dairy run into problems. So maybe are there any other distinctions you noticed in your observations? Because let me give a frame here too, because you're not a medical doctor, you're a PhD, but you do help and assist many people in their attempts to apply what you're learning to treat their cancers. So, and maybe that's overstated or incorrect, but maybe, so that's the frame. And so I'm wondering, in that process of helping and assisting others, what you've noticed and learned, maybe can share with us, and people seeking to apply the proper ketogenic diet to achieve these benefits.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not, qualified to give medical advice, but a lot of people do come to me for information about metabolic therapies for everything from ALS to seizures to cancer. And what I do is I direct them to information. One of the first websites is usually the Ketogenic Diet Resource. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine maintains that website, and they have a book on that, which is a ketogenic diet handbook for patients, and that's called the Ketogenic Diet Resource. And Tom Seifert's book, which is a good reference for people to go to, although it's a little too technical for most people to handle. But when people come to me, I direct them to a variety of resources. I have a website, ketonutrition.org, which I just put a lot of information on there. And what I ask to see is like hard scientific evidence. I like to see biomarkers of metabolic health, blood work, mm-hmm. Blood glucose, blood ketones, C-reactive protein, these things before during and after they've maintained nutritional ketosis or calorie restriction. And in hundreds of people that I looked at, I see all the markers of metabolic health improving. Everything's going in the right direction with carbohydrate restriction and with calorie restriction. So, yeah, I don't give diet advice specifically, but I give people I send them in the direction where they can find the information. And there are many simple tools that people can use. For example, a blood ketone and glucose meter that you can buy at any drugstore. And these are, can quickly get blood glucose and blood ketones, and you can assess your response to a nutritional intervention and then titrate the calories, the macronutrient ratios to optimize your body to be in what we call the metabolic zone. And the metabolic zone, our definition of it, is that the blood ketone levels actually rise to the level of blood glucose and above. So if you can produce sustained hypoglycemia with carbohydrate and calorie restriction and elevate blood ketones, it actually makes the hypoglycemia tolerable. So the ketones replace the glucose as the primary energy fuel for the brain. And it basically keeps the brain metabolism optimized and prevents fluctuations in your mood and your energy levels if you can sustain therapeutic ketosis with carbohydrate and calorie restriction. And if a person can do that, and they need to take it upon themselves, because someone who's 250 pounds with metabolic syndrome is going to have a different adaptive response to calorie restriction and carbohydrate restriction than the lean athlete that's 170 pounds who's using it, to treat a condition. So it's not a one size fits all, and the carbohydrate threshold that's needed for individuals to maintain nutritional ketosis can vary widely. Like I can get 150 grams of carbohydrates a day sometimes if I'm really active and still maintain nutritional ketosis. Where
Interesting.
Yeah, and only if I'm very active.
Most people would say
and it's
that,
high in fiber.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's this distinction too. If someone's getting 100 grams of carbohydrates, well, are you getting it from broccoli and salads, or are you getting it from cookies and candy? So there needs to be a clear, and that's why I think just assigning macronutrients, for diet can be counterproductive in some ways. So I think the composition of the food is equally important, especially in some people that just have very stubborn, persistent allergies that will impact their metabolic health and overall physiology. If your body is fighting something off with an allergic reaction, it's going to compromise the metabolic health. So that's why removing allergens from the diet is important. And there's several books out there that address this issue. Elaine Canton wrote a book called The Canton Ketogenic Diet, and that's been a useful resource for a lot of people that come to me. They say, I want to start the ketogenic diet, but I can't eat dairy. How do I follow it if I can't eat dairy, or if I can't, eat these other foods? And there's not a whole lot of ketogenic diet books out there that promote the diet and give an outline of the diet that's dairy free. And Elaine Canton's book addresses that. And I think, as people are becoming more aware of these issues that you mentioned, especially with dairy, I think people are looking to seek resources that can guide them to maintaining nutritional ketosis with a restriction in dairy protein.
Well, let's talk about the meter that you had mentioned that people can get at the drugstore. I'm assuming it's a finger prick model, and that there's a stick, a stick of regions or strips that you would use and purchase independent of that. Do these require a prescription from a physician, or can anyone walk into a drugstore and pick up one of these?
Yeah, and there's a variety of models out there. I use the most common one that you hear people talking about is Abbott Labs makes it. It's called the Precision Extra. And the glucose meter strips are about 50 cents per strip, but the ketone strips can range from $3 to $6 per strip.
Wow.
So they can be expensive, But what I find is that patients may just use a blood glucose or blood ketone meter maybe once a week, and they'll use the urine ketone strips, throughout the week to check their urine ketones, and they may just do a couple blood measurements. Typically, if your blood glucose stays 70 and below with carbohydrate, 75 and below with carbohydrate restriction, there's a good chance that you'll be in nutritional ketosis.
Okay.
Another
and that's
simple
what you've
way
seen
to
from
do
the
it.
research. When people do this, when they're below 75, you can save yourself
Yeah.
the expense and inconvenience of doing the blood ketones, because most of the time you're going to be in ketosis.
Yeah, and a cheap way to do it is just with the urine ketone strips. And if you're in ketosis by evidence of ketones in your urine, you're in a situation where you likely have depleted glycogen stores in the liver. You're maintaining low blood glucose. So the driver for hepatic ketogenesis is low blood glucose and low glycogen levels in the liver, depleted glycogen. So your body really won't make ketones, and they won't spill over in the urine unless you've achieved that level of glycogen depletion. So that's a good biomarker that you're in nutritional ketosis. I opt to use the blood ketone meter, the Precision Extra meter. There's a Novamax Plus meter that measured ketones, but this measures them lower. Then we found that it's relatively inaccurate. We found that the Precision Extra meter, which I have a number of these meters, another one is the cardio check meter, and this is an interesting meter because it can measure glucose, ketones, HDL, LDL, triglycerides, and a number of things. So you can buy these at any CVS, Walgreens, any drug.
Is there a prescription
store.
that's required?
No prescription required. Requires money though.
Okay.
So the strips are pretty expensive, and you can get them at diabetes wholesale, places online.
Sure.
Amazon.com sells them online. What I typically do, eBay, you can get them on eBay. I look for a sale and I buy a whole bunch of them at one time, typically thousands of them, because we do so many experiments. I literally bought like 20,000 ketone strips, because we do so many blood measurements with the experiments that we do. So I have a big stash here that we use, and we compare the measurements to the biochemical assays done with very expensive equipment at Case Western University, and we found that these meters are actually very accurate. The ketone measurements are accurate, and the blood measurements they're precise and they're accurate. So they're measuring, repeated measurements of the same sample give you the same numbers, and they're also in the same ballpark.
Yeah, it's wonderful stuff, and it's thanks to the exponential growth in technology, and I suspect in the not too distant future we'll have a little sensor we can put into our smartphone and then be able to analyze it that way for even less expensive.
That would be ideal. Yeah, like a little Band-Aid. I'm working with, I know some companies or foundations that are working on this, where you just put something like a Band-Aid that has nanosensors that can detect the blood in your capillaries and basically give you a metabolomic profile of all the metabolites in your. I think this technology is available to do this. It's going to take some R&D to actually develop a commercialized product. But
ultimately, you're going to want to have a protocol that you follow to achieve metabolic excellence, which is really why we're meeting today, to help us understand what that protocol would be. So, and I want to tap into your expertise because you guide so many people through this. So, for the average person who's interested in this, intrigued with this concept, who is concerned about optimizing their health and longevity, or treating an existing cancer or preventing cancer, the typical person is not fat adapted. There's two fuels to burn, fat and carbs, and most people are, I would say, and I suspect you would agree, over 99% are adapted to burn carbs as their primary fuel. Yeah. So our goal is to help them transition to that, and to achieve this metabolic excellence. But part of the reason for that too is what you alluded to earlier, is that when you are adapted to burn fat as your primary fuel, you are flexible. You don't have to eat every 2 to 3 hours. You can go for a full day and not be hungry, and that is the key. And it just seems like we're blowing smoke, but your hunger disappears because you have fuel to burn. If you're not adapted to burn fat, then
Yeah.
then you absolutely have to have those carbs, otherwise you're going to be miserably hungry. So
becomes a crisis situation.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
There's
you'll kill to get
major-
that food.
Yeah, major practical advantages to
So-
being fat adapted.
So how do we do this? My perspective, and I've got less experience than you, certainly, in helping people apply this practically, but is this concept called intermittent fasting, where we gradually allow people to restrict the window at which they're consuming food. So when I tell people to stop eating anything, all food except for water, for 3 hours before they go to bed, and then to gradually extend the time that they're consuming their first meal to the point where they're skipping breakfast. And they have a 6 to 8 hour window where they're restricting their calories to. So in a sense, you almost have to calorie restrict, although I don't tell them to calorie restrict, but it's sort of an artifact of following that concept because you're not eating food as long as through the day. So, and in that period, to provide substrates to make the transition to fat fuel burning as their primary fuel, is to use fats that break down real easily that are healthy, like full of medium chain triglycerides, like coconut oil, which can substitute frequently for the glucose, at least give them the energy that they don't have until they switch over. So I'm wondering what your comments are on that and any revisions that might make it easier for people to follow.
Yeah, it's a lot of good points you bring up there. A lot of good topics of discussion. You name it, I've tried it. I've tried intermittent fasting. I fasted for 1 week, and and I found that it was very tolerable. I had the benefit of already being fat adapted or keto adapted, but the third day was a little bit. I got a little bit hungry, but I wasn't hungry after about the fourth or fifth day, and by the seventh day it was very easy. And I actually gave a nutritional seminar on the last day of my fasting, and showing people, and I showed people my blood glucose, which was 51, and my ketones were like 5 or 6 millimolar. So earlier in the morning, I think I was like 44 or something, my blood glucose. So if a doctor saw that, they would think I would be in a coma. So so you name it, I've tried it, and I think from a practical standpoint, the important question is what's a person going to follow? So from my perspective, the biggest hurdle here is compliance. Compliance to a dietary strategy that makes calorie restriction feasible and possible. So and carbohydrate restriction, high fat diet, intermittent fasting is one way to achieve that. And I found that one meal per day kind of left me a little bit. I would tend to consume a little bit too much food, I think, on the single meal. I found 2 meals a day to be optimal for me. Although when I'm traveling, sometimes I'll go a whole day without eating. Or sometimes I'll just eat once per day. For example, if I'm traveling in Europe, or food's more expensive, or I have a pretty busy itinerary, one big meal at the end of the day is great. And can cut down on your budget for food too, So there's a lot of advantages, as you alluded to this pattern of intermittent fasting. And I think that it is a good strategy to promote metabolic health and to maintain nutritional ketosis if the person can adapt to it. Some lifestyles people, cannot readily adapt to it, but I found that most people can if they give it a try. Most people are resistant, but once they try it, they're amazed at how much better they feel. And it's also, you ask the question, are you an elite athlete? Are you, why are you doing it? And if your goal is to build muscle, if you're into, powerlifting, it might be, intermittent fasting may not be the best strategy for you.
Or how about a pregnant woman, which is, I would also include in that category.
Yeah, I think...
or someone with adrenal stress, too.
Yeah. And I think there's much to be said for just eating when you're hungry, right? And I think that, we're programmed, by the norms of society to eat breakfast, dinner and lunch, and with snacks in between, right?
Right.
And we've also been told that eating more frequent meals is more beneficial.
And breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Yeah, and those meals should be high in carbohydrates. And this creates, a pattern of eating that I believe is unhealthy. And it's just not feasible. I mean, with my work schedule, and it would just be hard. It would kind of tap into my productivity. So, I've frequently, I get blood work, probably about 4 to 5 times a year. And I've gradually shifted from eating 6 meals per day, which I used to eat when I was, very active, more active in athletics, and to this pattern of eating, which is like 2 meals per day. And my weight has come down a little bit, but I still maintain, I'm about 100 kilograms or, 225 pounds. And I can maintain that, and my metabolic health is good. So I'm overweight, but I've been able to use an intermittent fasting if you want to call eating just twice per day, kind of like a week intermittent fasting protocol. I've been able to maintain my strength and my power to weight ratio, if you want to call it that, by reducing my meal frequency. I'm actually stronger now, pound for pound, than I was when I was eating.
That is amazing. Once you give the body what it needs.
Yeah, and the body is pretty smart. It just kind of takes what it needs when you give it the right foods, and I find that if your overall physiological health is better, your body will kind of break down, assimilate, and utilize the nutrients that you give it much more efficiently. So you'll have a repartitioning effect, and the nutrients will go preferentially to rebuilding and maintaining muscle, and into energy pathways that kind of give you sustained energy effects. Whereas, if you're eating carbohydrates or you're overeating carbohydrates, it just causes a metabolic situation where you have pro-inflammation, your fluctuations in blood glucose, which can decrease your cognitive and physical performance. So, a colleague of mine, Jeff Volek, he works with advanced athletes, these ultra endurance runners who run like 100 miles at altitude, in the rain, over hills. And he develops their nutritional strategies. And Jeff Volek has written books, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance, and has shown conclusively that, at least in endurance athletes requiring stamina and strength, that carbohydrate restriction and even an intermittent fasting type feeding schedule is actually optimal to enhance physical performance. So he's demonstrated this and has a number of studies and Jeff has published probably over 250 peer-reviewed articles.
Wow.
So he's definitely put out enough research to validate this pattern, this way of eating, this carbohydrate restriction and decreased meal frequency.
Yes, and that is a great strategy if you're going to use that. But if your goal, from my perspective, is longevity and optimal health, I don't think that's a wise strategy to achieve that. I think it's going to be counterproductive. I'm far more a fan of the high-intensity, slower, less frequent type of exercise, although I used to do longer exercise and ran marathons when I was younger, and not as wise. But I want to comment on one point you mentioned earlier, which was that, and I honor and respect that and recommend that principle also, is that listen to your body, that eat when you're hungry. But the caution and the caveat I think that one needs to apply here is that that's valid if you're adapted to burn fat as your primary fuel. If you're adapted to burn carbs, your body's going to lie to you because it's going to want to fill those glycogen stores up. So I'm wondering if you can, from your experience in guiding people through this process, what your range is that you find people require to make this shift if they're applying intermittent fasting as a tool to achieve fat adaptation.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's no easy answer to it, and I think it varies tremendously. Some people just like to eat. I mean, some people like the fact of, they have the time, the money, and they enjoy eating. And eating is a pleasurable thing, and I don't think people should deprive themselves of eating. And if eating more frequent is pleasurable to them and they can maintain metabolic health doing that, then, I don't try to change their eating pattern if they don't want to. People need to want to change, and usually that results from some kind of underlying pathology. The doctor tells them they need to lose weight. They're trying to get in shape for an event or something.
They have a diagnosis of cancer?
Yes, exactly. So in these situations, you need to, assess the person's current eating strategy. You need to assess their metabolic health. Blood work is important. If they're, if they have some renal insufficiency, if they have, different. If they're hypercholesterolemia, if there's factors that need to be considered before giving someone advice for a nutritional strategy. But I think calorie restriction is basically the benefits cannot be denied, and any eating pattern that promotes a tolerable means for calorie restriction is going to improve overall health and metabolic health.
But
And
what's the range of time you think it takes people to achieve that, in your experience? Is it 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months?
It depends on where they're coming from, but I think within 4 to 6 weeks, most people can fully adapt and embrace a low carbohydrate, reduced meal frequency eating pattern. And I think it takes about 4 to 6 weeks. And actually, this would correlate with the exercise performance studies done by Stephen Finney and Jeff Volek that showed that the performance deficits that you see with carbohydrate restricting carbohydrates can actually drop physical performance. And then this starts to come back up, to baseline at about 4 weeks, and in about 6 weeks, at least in advanced cyclists, they can achieve far better. And that's kind of evidence for me that they're keto adapted in the sense that their body is better utilizing, transporting ketones maybe across the blood-brain barrier, and that they're fully utilizing and optimizing fats and ketones for fuel. And this may correlate with just an overall sense of well-being, being that their body is fat adapted or keto adapted, that their brain, their organ, their whole physiology is in tune and adapted to this nutritional ketosis. So that can be hard for some people, because it's literally forcing their body to use a fuel that it doesn't want to use, because it's mimicking the physiological phenomenon of starvation. And the body doesn't want to be in starvation for survival. So carbohydrate restriction mimics, the physiological state of survival.
So the reason,
fasting.
I believe, most likely the reason this works is that it follows one of the principles that I believe is pervasive to good health, which is RAP. We replicate our ancestral practices. And our ancestors did not have access to food 24/7, so they regularly went through periods of decreased calories. So that's probably why this works. If our ancestors didn't, then we wouldn't need to do that. But we have to honor our biochemistry and to achieve those benefits. So the 4 to 6 week window is phenomenal. That's good to know. And then I would encourage people to stick with it, to get through that. Use a lot of coconut oil to give yourself energy until you've achieved. I mean, you could do it with the meters that you mentioned, but you also, this is such a huge point, the hunger disappears. When your hunger for carbs disappears, you know you are burning fat, because that's one of the side effects. And it's obvious, it's plain as day, it's not a mystery. It's like the turning lights on in a room. You'll know as soon as it hits, because it's so obvious. And it's so consistent. I mean, it happens to almost everyone.
I would agree. There are some people that fail to adapt to the ketogenic diet, but they're the exception rather than the rule. And most people who say, I tried a ketogenic diet, I just couldn't do it. And I was like, well, tell me what you did. It's like, well, I was eating, like 200 grams of protein and 30 grams of fat and 0 carbs. I was like, no, you're following a high protein diet, and your blood glucose was all over the place, and you weren't making ketones because you're not giving your body the fats that are, needed. The ketones are a product of the liver. So basically, give your body fats, feed the liver fats from your adipose tissue or from fats from your diet, and it will make ketones. And I think it really comes down to having that sustained nutritional ketosis to fuel your brain and keep your brain happy, shall we say, during periods of reduced glucose availability. And it's those dips in blood glucose that's going to create that glucose withdrawal syndrome in the brain. It's a dysphoria, I guess you would say. You just don't feel good. And I see it all the time in people that I know that skip a meal. They're like, I got to eat now. We got to stop someplace. I got to eat.
Right.
Because I ate 3 hours ago and I ate carbohydrates and now I'm hungry again and I got to eat something. And when you're fat adapted, you forget what that feels like.
Right. It's just gone.
I remember feeling. I used to eat a lot of fish and rice and pasta, and I grew up in an Italian family where it was basically a pasta-based family with lots of bread. And I remember feeling hungry and like the feeling like I need to eat right now. I need to eat something. And I don't feel that way anymore. I actually have to remind myself to eat.
Yeah, it's metabolic freedom and flexibility once you achieve this. So it's really worth the effort. It's 4 to 6 weeks of somewhat discomfort, no question, or it's an uncomfortable feeling, but definitely worth the effort. I want to comment on, I would agree with you that 2 meals a day is probably optimal. What I find myself doing, though, because it's just the hassle factor and inconvenience, I mean, I will eat 2 meals a day, but frequently when I'm at home, I'll eat 1 meal a day. But I substitute snacks around that. And the snacks are typically 2 macadamia nuts for 2 reasons. One is because they're the highest nuts and highest fat in any nut that I know of, and the lowest in protein. So it's closest to that metabolic window that you want. And then also a candy that I make from coconut. It's primarily coconut oil, some coconut flour, coconut flakes, and some natural sweeteners like stevia. So I supplement that, so I'm getting other calories and fats around that big meal a day, which typically varies from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So have you ever play with something like that where you're having these smaller little snack meals around that?
I do that. My typical morning routine is to wake up and actually have an amino acid supplement, which, by the way, is leucine, a little bit of leucine, a little bit of amino acid mixture, and some spirulina. Actually, it tends to be just a buffer for the amino acids. And I'll have a little bit of an amino acid mixture when I wake up with some spirulina and a few things, plant-based proteins actually, just a small amount. And then I brew coffee. And I don't know if you're familiar with bulletproof coffee.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So basically, I take almost a third of a stick of butter and kind of blend it up and whip it up with some strong coffee. And I'll sip on that and just kind of work, wake up early in the morning, 5, and I'll have the most productive, 2, 3, 4 hours of working just off fat, essentially, off the butter. And then I have to kind of force myself to eat breakfast, and this is kind of contrary to what I was just talking about, but I know if I don't eat breakfast and I get into a work pattern and I'm at work until like 8 o'clock at night, I probably will get hungry during the day. So I might have a couple, free range eggs and a little bit of sardines and broccoli. I know that doesn't sound like a very appetizing breakfast, right? Like sardines in the morning, but
it works.
But that's typically what I eat. Yeah, it's just it's really heavy on fat, and kind of moderate with the protein. Not I used to eat like a dozen egg whites and oatmeal. I remember that being one of a staple breakfast. But now I eat a couple whole eggs. Yeah, and I cook it in coconut oil and usually have some kind of greens like broccoli, asparagus, or spinach omelet or something like that, some mushrooms, and that'll sustain me. The butter in the morning with my coffee and a high-fat, moderate protein, low-carb breakfast will sustain me for half of the day, 12 hours. And I might hit some, MCT oil in the middle of the day, coconut oil, or a little, I have an amino acid supplement that I take occasionally. And then I eat, dinner is my bigger meal of the day, and it typically follows some kind of physical activity, whether it be, walking the dog or going to the gym or, some kind of physical activity. So I have it immediately after. Okay. And it's typically, protein, a big salad, and lots of fat. So my fat intake is probably about 300 grams a day. Wow. Believe it or not.
So percentage-wise, how many calories would you say are from fat? Is it like percentage-wise, like 70% of your calories are from fat?
Yeah, I would say about that. Yeah, on some days it might be as low as 50, and on other days it may be as high as 80 or 90. Okay. But about 70, that's pretty accurate description. So
that's basically what I follow too, about 70% fat. Most conventional nutritionists or dietitians would strongly disagree with that, of course.
Our research here has evolved By basically, I was studying the effect of neuroprotective agents against seizures, and I stumbled upon nutritional ketosis as an effective way to prevent seizures. And that led to a number of projects, probably 5 or 6 projects that are ongoing now that are giving compelling evidence to show that metabolic therapies in the form of calorie restriction, ketogenic diet, or ketone supplements. So what I didn't really mention, similar to MCT product, that we develop and test ketone esters, ketone salts.
Oh.
And so creating nutritional or even starvation ketosis without dietary restriction is of interest to the military, because they are aware that nutritional ketosis has a very powerful anti-seizure effect, which is important for Navy SEAL divers that use a closed-circuit rebreather. So if we can achieve that without calorie restriction or without carbohydrate restriction and elevate blood ketones to the level of fasting ketosis, we can, in essence, feed the brain an alternative fuel that can enhance brain metabolism and preserve brain function under periods of stress and under periods of oxidative stress, for example, high pressure oxygen breathing. So the ketone supplements, ketone esters and ketone salts that we developed have been shown to be very neuroprotective, and we've published a report on that. And in the American Journal of Physiology, actually, the title is Therapeutic Ketosis as a Seizure Prevention Against Oxygen Toxicity. And tomorrow, actually, there'll be a press report out, a press release on our paper that was recently accepted in PLOS One journal. It's an open access journal, so readers will be able to get this. And the title of it is The Ketogenic Diet and Hyperbaric Oxygen as a Therapy for Metastatic Cancer. So as you know, most people who die of cancer die of not the tumor per se, but the metastatic process. And there's really no treatment or cure for metastatic cancer. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to study it, because no one's really studying it because it's hard to show efficacy in any kind of animal model of metastatic cancer. And we've demonstrated that the ketogenic diet by itself can extend survival in animal models of metastatic cancer, but when it's combined with hyperbaric oxygen therapy 3 times per week, that there is an additive effect, and that you get a significant reduction in tumor growth, decrease in tumor size, and significant extension of life when therapeutic ketosis achieved with the ketogenic diet is combined with hyperbaric oxygen. So tumors thrive in a low oxygen environment. As a tumor grows, it exceeds its ability to supply oxygen to the center of the tumor, and that low level of oxygen, and we call hypoxia, actually further activates the oncogenes, the cancer-promoting genes, activates things like HIF-1 alpha, VEGF, IGF-1 signaling goes up, and hyperbaric oxygen can reverse tumor hypoxia intermittently, and in doing that, it can actually turn off the oncogenes, and there's published reports on this. More importantly is that, the tumor thrives in a low oxygen environment, and it's adapted to that low oxygen environment. So when you saturate a tumor with oxygen, because the mitochondria are damaged, it overproduces oxygen-free radicals in the form of superoxide anion. And this oxygen-induced increase in free radicals can actually cause the tumor to kill itself. It overproduces free radicals, in the presence of high levels of oxygen.
This is a good benefit of free radicals.
Can damage the tumor. And when that natural form of oxidative stress is given to the tumor during the ketogenic diet, so the ketogenic diet will put metabolic stress on the tumor cells by limiting glucose availability and elevating blood ketones, which your normal cells can use, but cancer cells can't use. So it compromises the metabolism of the tumor. And then you hit the tumor with a high pressure of oxygen by hyperbaric oxygen, which is breathing 100% oxygen at an elevated hyperbaric pressure. We're at 1 atmosphere now, and we use like 2.2 atmospheres or 2.5 atmospheres of oxygen, which will probably increase the tumor oxygen tenfold. So we're using a natural form instead of radiation, which works by killing cancer by causing free radical formation, by destroying the tissue and creating free radicals. Hyperbaric oxygen is just a more natural way to do it without damaging the natural cells. And it seems to be synergistic with the ketogenic diet. So there will be a report on this tomorrow, a press release, and the paper will be available tomorrow.
Well, please send us a link to that. We'll put it in the
Yes.
interview.
Yes, I will. And we also, I'm working with a foundation called Winning the Fight for neurodegenerative diseases. And this is a foundation primarily to treat patients with ALS. And I've been testing what has been termed the Diana protocol. So the Diana protocol is a metabolic therapy that elevates blood ketone levels and actually is a combination of nutritional supplements that includes alpha ketoglutarate, which is a Krebs cycle intermediate and energy metabolite, a soluble form of CoQ10, a soluble ubiquinol, GABA, the amino acid GABA, and caprylic acid, which is an 8-carbon medium-chain triglyceride. So these things in combination have been shown anecdotally in patients to stall the progression of ALS. And this observation was first shown in Deanna Tadone. Her father is a retired orthopedic surgeon. His name is Dr. Vince Tadone. And they have a foundation. They contacted me, and I met Deanna, I met with the family, and I observed that they were getting a real therapeutic effect to this metabolic therapy, which involved elevating blood ketones and giving the body high energy intermediates in combination with cofactors like soluble CoQ10 to enhance metabolic efficiency. And the reason why this works is that all neurodegenerative diseases are associated with impaired energy metabolism, and that the impairment of the cell to make energy causes the membrane potential to collapse, and then it oversecretes glutamate, which is an excitatory amino acid transmitter. It can activate the NMDA receptors, AMPA receptors, which can be excitotoxic. So the hallmarks of ALS pathology is glutamate excitotoxicity, excess calcium, and oxidative stress. And these are, what I believe, downstream epiphenomenon or downstream consequences of failed energy metabolism. So if we address the issue upstream by giving a metabolic therapy that fuels the cells, in this case the motor neurons for ALS, that helps the cells maintain ATP production within the cell, the cells will maintain their resting membrane potential, and it will prevent the collapse of the metabolism, which contributes to excess glutamate excitotoxicity. So many of the therapies now are just, blocking the glutamate receptors or blocking the accumulation of the protein, the toxic proteins that occur as a consequence of failed energy metabolism. The therapy that we're testing, and I think the therapies of the future, will be metabolic therapies that address the underlying metabolic dysfunction associated with the cell. And for some reason, in patients that have ALS, they are responsive to TCA cycle intermediates or Krebs cycle metabolites. When these are given at high doses, it seems to restore energy metabolism, perhaps in the motor neurons, which decreases the symptoms. So the question is, are we just decreasing the symptoms, or are we stalling the pathology? So Deanna's been taking this Deanna Tadone has been using this protocol for several years now, and it seems she has beaten the odds as far as progression of ALS, which is a terrible disease.
Sure.
And a number
worst.
of other patients. I think there's 1,000 patients that have registered with the foundation at Johns Hopkins, Duke University, Emory, and these are being evaluated. It's too early to tell, but our animal studies definitely showed an extension of survival with this metabolic therapy that elevates blood ketones.
Do you think this would be also helpful for other neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or even autoimmune motor dysfunction diseases like multiple muscular dystrophy?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Alzheimer's disease. Actually, today in the paper, the Tampa Bay Times here, there's a story of Mary Newport, and I know
sure.
Mary. She's
Coconut
a good
oil,
friend of
sure.
mine.
Yeah.
So as you can see, Mary's in the corner there with her husband, and another report showing that the Alzheimer's Institute here has actually started a clinical trial to determine. They have coconut oil and a placebo, which is olive oil or some kind of plant-based oil, and that they give to patients. I think there's 60 patients in the trial. And the question is, does giving coconut oil enhance brain metabolism to delay the Alzheimer's pathology? So they're going to look at, not only cognitive function, but actually, do an amyloid PET scan to see if it's impacting the progression of the pathological proteins.
But do you think the same supplements would be helpful? The same supplements used for the ALS would be helpful in those diseases, like Alzheimer's?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and I know the foundation is in discussion with the Alzheimer's Institute because they have reports. Alzheimer's patients have contacted this foundation that primarily specializes in ALS therapy, but they are reports from Alzheimer's patients that are telling them that it's working for Alzheimer's disease, that the tremors are decreasing, that there's an improvement in cognitive function. So this is perhaps might put pressure on, the Institute to run a study to test the Deanna protocol, which is being used in many ALS patients to perhaps use it in Alzheimer's patients, and Parkinson's disease patients too have reported.
Excellent.
I've had several contact me because they know we're doing the animal studies on the transgenic animals that are models for these diseases, and we saw a positive effect, and that'll be published soon. But other people have
What do you
been
think about
contacting us.
the possibility of using it for autoimmune motor disease like muscular dystrophy?
Yeah,
do you think
that's
there'd be benefit there?
I have a student of mine has MS and maintains nutritional ketosis. He's on a calorie-restricted ketogenic diet. He essentially does intermittent fasting with coconut oil and MCT throughout the day. And he appears to have stalled the progression of his MS. And that's just one observation there. But a number of people, maybe about 4 or 5 people with MS have contacted me and kind of given me, the protocol that they're using, which typically involves some kind of ketogenic diet, calorie restricted or not, with lots of coconut oil and MCT oil. And some of them rub the MCT oil or coconut oil into their skin. It does have the ability to be transdermally crossed into, so, whether it elevates blood ketones through that way, we have not tested that yet, but they seem to be getting a therapeutic benefit, at least symptomatically, in their in MS and in other neurological diseases.
Perfect.
But MS is an interesting one, and I think a nutritional strategy is very important in MS because I think the immune system is obviously an important in driving the progression of the pathology. And MS is really a mystery, but removing toxins and removing potential allergens from the diet is very important.
Now, can you also provide us with a list of those resources that someone could use if they wanted to apply this? Because that was, I think, you mentioned a number of them, a number of books, a number of websites.
Yeah, I think a good place to start would actually be for cancer. You're probably aware of Tom Seiford's book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And, this is very academic, and it's a little probably too technical for most people. But within this book, there are patient protocols that are being used for clinical trials with a restricted ketogenic diet for glioblastoma, brain tumors. So I know the protocols in this book are going to be the ones that are implemented in clinical trials. So I think that's important to know. So I highly recommend this book. If a patient brings this book to their doctor, there is irrefutable evidence that Tom has amassed in this book to support cancer as a disease of metabolic origin, and support showing that cancer of all types are genetically heterogeneous, diverse, but they have this similar metabolic phenotype, which is the Warburg effect, which is aerobic glycolysis. So even in the presence of oxygen, they continue to use glucose as a fuel and pump out lactate. So with that knowledge, we can exploit that. And the protocols described in this book, the data presented in this book, gives the reader a firm understanding of what cancer is, of how to prevent it, and how to treat it if one has it. And there are a number of, there's case reports in the book, there's specific protocols in the book, and there's a firm history of kind of how we got into the present state. We've developed a large variety of genetic therapies that are having no effect. The Human Genome Project has given us a lot of different therapies, and none of them are working. So something has to change. Mm-hmm. And with the combination of anecdotal reports, animal studies, case reports that are documented, I think that book is a very important resource for patients and for their doctors to support the use of these metabolic therapies. Another book, I think we talked about briefly, is more of the history of cancer, is The Emperor of All Maladies. Mm-hmm. Here, the biography of cancer. So this is a great book to read prior to reading Tom's book, because it presents the whole history of cancer, right? And the author is very articulate, and it reads like a very suspenseful novel, but it leaves the reader kind of desperate for a therapy. It's basically kind of talking about the failure of modern medicine to provide us with an answer as to why cancer occurs, how to prevent it, and how to treat it. And I think Tom's book picks up where that book leaves off, and it gives a firm scientific background and rationale for a metabolic origin for cancer, and delves into the biochemistry and the physiology of how metabolic therapies work and how to implement them. And there are resources within the book that can guide the patient for that. And a friend of mine by the name of Ellen Davis maintains a website that has been really helpful for a lot of patients I'm come in contact with. It's one of the first websites I direct people to. And that website is the Ketogenic Diet Resource. And the Ketogenic Diet Resource is a very comprehensive website that describes how to implement the ketogenic diet. And there's recipes on there. You're featured on there. There's a lot of links to your website. And recently, Ellen Davis has finished a book that is a patient hand guide for using the ketogenic diet for the metabolic management of cancer. And the problem I get with Tom's book, although it's very eloquent and he can kind of break down biochemistry in fairly simple terms, it's still over the head of many patients that seek a resource to help them. So Ellen has completed a patient guide to the ketogenic diet. It's on her website, and it's been a tremendous resource for people wanting to try this strategy. The blood ketone and glucose meters that we talked about would be an essential tool to assess the important biomarkers, the blood beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is one of the main ketones, and blood glucose, to ensure that you're in nutritional ketosis and you're in that metabolic zone that we talked about. Then if a patient achieves the metabolic zone, that therapeutic zone is when ketones actually are elevated above blood glucose. And if those biomarkers can be achieved and maintained, typically what you see is either the tumor slows in growth, it completely stops growing, or it starts shrinking. So you get three responses. Occasionally you'll have people that go into remission quickly. after. And there's some anecdotal reports of people with advanced metastatic cancer going into remission with nutritional ketosis. And in the people that I know, the few reports that I've seen, one of them, one person, I encouraged them to do a therapeutic fast. So, and when implementing metabolic therapy for cancer, I think it should be encouraged that if the patient is healthy enough, that they should undergo a therapeutic fast of 5 to 10 days, up to 2 weeks if they're able to do it. If a patient's overweight, they should be able to achieve 2 weeks, 10 days of fasting, at least a week. I mean, I did a week and it was fairly easy, but my health was good. So I think the fastest way to get into nutritional ketosis is with a therapeutic fast. And during this fast, a patient can take non-caloric nutritional support, which could be in the form of chicken broth or coconut oil. I think coconut oil and MCT oil, although they provide calories, they can help someone, overcome the glucose withdrawal symptoms that typically hit on day 2 or day 3 of a complete fasting. So I found that can be helpful in some patients. But a therapeutic fast followed by a restricted ketogenic diet is an effective way for a patient to implement a strategy to metabolically manage their cancer. Now, they can use this as a standalone therapy, or they can combine it with standard of care. So, my recommendation would be, to track the tumor growth with a CAT scan or MRI. And if you implement a metabolic therapy and the tumor shrinks or the tumor blood markers go down, then I would discourage someone from using chemotherapy or the standard of care, especially if the standard of care has been shown in their particular cancer to be largely ineffective for their type of cancer, which is often the case, especially with metastatic cancer. Only a few cancers are responsive to the standard of care. Yeah. Now, my colleague at Barrow Neurological Institute, Adrian Scheck, is working on, and I think has gotten the administration there to conduct a clinical trial that combines the ketogenic diet with radiation. Now, I'm not a big fan of radiation, and Tom Seifert is not a big fan of radiation, but Adrian Scheck is a brilliant PhD researcher at Barrow Neurological Institute, and she's done some research on a brain tumor model in rodents and has been able to achieve complete remission in an aggressive brain tumor model with combining the ketogenic diet with radiation. So as we talked about, the ketogenic diet puts tremendous metabolic stress on the cancer cells by limiting glucose availability and elevating ketones, which may actually have an anti-cancer effect that we're studying right now. So she has demonstrated that the ketogenic diet can prolong survival, but in several animals within the group that received the ketogenic diet plus radiation, some of them were completely cured of their aggressive brain tumors. And I'm not aware of anyone that has been able to demonstrate this in this particular syngenic animal model of a brain tumor, which is most similar to a glioblastoma. So, and I would, Adrian's work is published on PLOS One journal. If you just Google the ketogenic diet and radiation, you'll come across this work. And this is an example of someone that, a study that combines the ketogenic diet with the standard of care, radiation, and showing a synergy there that is important. Once again, though, the track record for the standard of care, particularly radiation, is not very good. But we have studied radiation with people eating a standard diet. In many cases, the people are encouraged to overconsume nutritional products like Ensure, which is basically just like sugary milk, and to overconsume excess calories to prevent the side effects associated with radiation, which is nausea and things like that. So, the question is if perhaps we can unmask the potential benefits of the standard of care if the patient is maintained in nutritional ketosis. So that's a question that needs to be addressed and studied. My gut feeling is that all attempts should be made to pursue a non-toxic therapy for cancer and other neurological diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's.
Which is why I was interested in the synergy that you mentioned with the hyperbaric oxygen, which is available from many natural medicine physicians. It's not that difficult to find. So, but I'm wondering, if a person has metastatic cancer, what your gut feeling is, because I know this probably hasn't been studied, but if a person had that and they were to implement this radical, not radical, but very disciplined application of ketogenic diet with hyperbaric oxygen, what's the effectiveness? What's your gut feeling? To me, it would be probably over 70, 80, maybe even over 90% effective. Obviously, it depends on when you implement it and how rigid they were, but what's your best guess as to how effective it might be?
That's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, I know,
I think my answer is that it'll be more effective than metabolic therapy combined with hyperbaric oxygen will be more effective than anything currently available that I know of. There's a lot of, reports on the internet of this or that working. Lowering blood, producing a sustained hypoglycemia with therapeutic ketosis, combining that with another modality that's non-toxic, like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, is a win-win situation in my book, because you're not compromising the long-term health of the patient. The main side effect of chemotherapy and radiation is cancer. So you're damaging the genetic material, the DNA of cancer cells, by hitting them with a cytotoxic chemotherapy and radiation. And typically what you're doing best, you're just buying time.
It impairs your immune system, and your immune system is what you need to fight the cancer. So it's destroying the very process that your body desperately needs.
Very good point. So a robust immune system is very important for beating cancer long term. If your immune system is compromised, it's setting you up for getting a major recurrence of cancer, an aggressive form of the cancer, and setting you up for even different cancers in the future. So hyperbaric oxygen has been shown to be very immune stimulating. In a colleague of mine that was at University of Pennsylvania, Stephen Thom was there and demonstrated that hyperbaric oxygen can increase stem cells, the release of stem cells, and the production of stem cells. So you have drugs like GM-CSF, which is sold as Leukine, GCSF, which is sold as Neupogen, I believe. These things cost like $1,000 a week to take. And they work by stimulating the release of stem cells in the body, by stimulating your bone marrow. Now, hyperbaric oxygen has essentially been shown to do the same thing. You have a mobilization of stem cells. So where those stem cells go, and if they're therapeutic, that's another question. But for example, if someone has a wound injury, and they undergo hyperbaric oxygen, you have a mobilization of these stem cells, and they tend to hone in on the sites of injury and assist in the repair of the wound, for example. Now, how they're doing that is also another question, whether they're releasing anti-inflammatory factors or actually becoming cells of the same phenotype to build the scaffolding for the wound itself is what people are studying. We're actually studying that. So there are modalities out there that are not in the pill form, that are not sold by big pharma, that there may not be a whole lot of profit potential in suggesting that someone do fasting and the ketogenic diet. But we know from the science, from anecdotal reports, that these are very valid therapies that can be implemented cost effectively by the patient. Hyperbaric oxygen can be, a cost burden. One of the questions that we want to address is, do you need to get inside a hard shell hyperbaric chamber to reap the benefits of hyperbaric oxygen therapy? We're going to design a dose to response study where we just use 100% oxygen at normal pressure. So putting essentially, A person could put on a mask and breathe
Sure.
100% oxygen, or using a low level of hyperbaric oxygen, like 1.3 atmospheres of oxygen, which there are various soft shell chambers on the market for like anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 that are available that can increase the partial pressure, the barometric pressure, and in 100% environment, you can get mild hyperbaric oxygen. So the question is, will we get the same robust response in our animal model with that? And that could be very useful,
you'll have to keep us posted.
From a practical.
What you're seeking to find is the MED, the minimally effective dose.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that would be very profoundly useful information.
Yeah, and that's, it's a big difference between telling someone that they need to do, 2 atmospheres of hyperbaric oxygen, 5 times per week, which is the standard protocol, to pay up to $200 per session and go to a hyperbaric oxygen clinic, where they, perhaps maybe 1.3 atmospheres of oxygen in a low-cost soft shell chamber, or even 100% oxygen at normal baric pressure just 3 times a week could yield the same benefit. Yeah. So these are questions that we want to address. And we only tested, we tested the standard level of oxygen just because that's what people do. And it's kind of an arbitrary number, but we figured we'd start with that and then do a dose response to see.
Well, you have to keep us posted, but even if people, your future experiments show that they need the higher dose, it's a little more costly, but it's a lot less expensive than the alternative, and it's a lot more effective. So ultimately, you want something that's going to work. So it would be great to find what the lowest dose possible is working, but even at the high dose, is probably more than worth it.
Yeah, and I need to stress too that the work that we've done was in an animal model of cancer, and there have been reviews on the effects of hyperbaric oxygen therapy in cancer patients, and the weight of the evidence supports a therapeutic benefit to hyperbaric oxygen, especially for things like radiation necrosis and different. But all these studies were not done in patients that have achieved nutritional ketosis. So nutritional ketosis, I believe, will kind of synergize with hyperbaric oxygen therapy and will allow the benefits to take place, and there's many reasons for that I can go into biochemically. But I think, that's what needs to be done. And that's what we've shown even in our animal models. Giving a standard diet with hyperbaric oxygen therapy there was a trend for increased survival, but it wasn't like a major statistically significant finding. It was only, when we combined hyperbaric oxygen therapy with a nutritional therapy that we saw the true benefits
and you get
being
the
achieved.
Full metabolic benefits, which is great. Well, it has been an absolute delight to connect with you. You've enlightened so many of us on this really important topic, and I'm sure it will be reviewed by many over and again, because there's a lot of information here. So I want to thank you for joining us, and I want you to continue your research, and hopefully we'll have a long collaboration, and you'll update us in the future on what you're finding.
Yeah, we have a lot of projects ongoing right now. And one will be released tomorrow, as I mentioned. But thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure to be on your show here. And let's keep in contact, and I can keep you abreast of what we're doing.
Okay.
New things on the horizon.
So
the main goal is to get these therapies into clinical trials. So we really need, for that to happen, we need funding. Right now we've applied for funding, but it's really, as the cancer industry or research is much of it is funded by the pharmaceutical company.
Sure.
And there's really no companies like that are funding the kind of therapies that we're developing. So, and we're positioned to make even a little bit of funding go far. So if we can kind of develop the funding to validate these therapies in a preclinical model, that sets us up for, getting approval to do this in human clinical trials, which will give the evidence that people need to be able to embrace this therapy, and for their doctors to help them. The main problem we see is that patients want to do this, they know it's effective, but their doctors have never heard of it, so they're not going to assist their patients and help their patients implement these metabolic therapies simply because they're not trained in nutrition. That's one of the problems, but they're looking for the human clinical trial, and there's there's the logistics behind doing a diet study, and also who's going to fund it.
Right.
So we really need to do this.
A lot of work ahead of us. All right. Well, thanks so much. So I think you've provided us with a wealth of information that people can delve into, and I'm wondering if you could maybe summarize some of the basic principles, and then perhaps most importantly provide the resources, repeat what you had mentioned earlier, that people can follow and go for more specific details if they're intrigued with this concept and want to integrate it into their lifestyle.
Sure. So just a summary of kind of my thoughts on it.
Right.
Okay, well, just kind of taking a big step back from where we started, my